Protests in China is unthinkable. It is not a democracy, it's not a nation, and it's not a government that takes kindly to the people of the country, the Aam Aadmi, if you may, going out and protesting. But the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, is facing perhaps his biggest challenge and threat ever since he was re-nominated for a record third term. Now, Chinese protesters have been hitting the streets in at least 6 cities across campus universities and in factories. What are they protesting? They're protesting the zero COVID policy of Xi Jinping, which has made them prisoners in their own homes. Some people have not left their homes for over 100 days. Since the beginning of the pandemic, China's policy has been a zero tolerance towards any COVID cases. They've had some of the most severest lockdowns in the world. And for the first 2 years, it was fine. People thought that, the government knows what they're doing. But over time, it has been wearing on the nerves of the Chinese people. In Beijing, Shanghai, several other Chinese cities, there have been widespread protests. And look at the way people are protesting. You'll see pictures of people holding up blank pieces of paper because they're trying to say that this is a country where we can say nothing. You have people protesting in iPhone factories, and that's why the stock of Apple has actually fallen in opening trade. Commodity prices have been impacted because this is, after all, the second largest economy in the world. And you know what the trigger was? The trigger was actually a fire that broke out in an apartment building in China where at least 10 people died. Now, as news of that spread, the average Chinese person believed that those 10 people died because COVID lockdowns and the building was locked down so severely that they were not able to escape the flames. That has been the sort of flame that has led to the fire of these protests spreading. Let's just take a look at how intense these protests are.
Slogans, placards, protests. These dramatic scenes are from China's Wuhan, barely a month after Xi Jinping won a historic third term as president. The angry protesters are demanding Xi's ouster, something that was considered unthinkable in the communist country only till last week. The simmering anger over arbitrary lockdowns erupted after at least 10 people died in a fire in Urumqi. Protesters believe rescue efforts were disrupted due to lockdown measures, though Chinese authorities have denied it. Student protests also broke out at the prestigious Tsinghua University in Beijing and the Communication University in Nanjiang. The protest against COVID lockdowns has spread from Shanghai to Beijing, even as China reported close to 40,000 COVID cases on Monday. Authorities are scrambling to contain the fresh surge in infections. The crackdown by the Chinese regime has already started. Protests are being pushed back, arrested or forcibly made to disrupt and disperse. But the Communist Party's official mouthpiece, People's Daily, declared on Sunday that the government will continue to firmly adhere to the zero COVID policy. The unprecedented protests are one of the biggest challenges to Xi Jinping's authority and the last thing the global economy needs in a deadly mix of political instability and economic uncertainty in the world's second biggest economy. Will Xi Jinping relent or the lockdown continue? The answer will have a huge ramification on investor wealth. With Boski Gupta, Adirat Singh for ET Now.
Kawal Sibal, former Foreign Secretary, with me on the show. Manoj Joshi, Distinguished Fellow ORF, speaking with us today. Anil Trigunayat, former Ambassador, speaking with us, as is Ajay Bagga, Chairman of Elements Platform and Market Expert. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Let me come to you first, Mr. Joshi. I know you track China very, very closely. Is this something that has caught Xi Jinping completely off guard?
No, I don't think so. I think, we've been seeing this developing over time. And you know that earlier this month, the Politburo Standing Committee actually took a decision that we will ease off on this policy, that it will be a more targeted policy. The problem is that the policy is implemented at the local level. at the local level, what happens is that if there is an outbreak, the local officials are punished. So they always err on the side of caution. They overdo things. And I think they have overdone things in many places. I mean, you've had Urumqi in Xinjiang, where there has been a lockdown for 3 months. Earlier in Shanghai, there was a lockdown for 2 months. Now, we have also known, I have known personally in my own locality where I was locked down because there was infection in the neighboring house. But after a certain period of time, maybe 1 or 2 weeks, things eased off. But what the Chinese are confronting is a kind of a excessive zeal of the officials, where people are, kind of blocking off of apartments,
Right.
not allow, and they require daily testing. In some cases, they require daily testing.
It's basically their patience is wearing thin. And I think what's maybe contributing to it, Ambassador Sibal, let me come to you on this, is that the rest of the world seems to have moved on. There were reports today that when the World Cup is being broadcast in China, they're editing out the pictures of the audience because they don't want to show the Chinese people that there are people out there sitting without masks enjoying a football game. That will anger them even more.
Well, we have to look at this very carefully and not reach any hasty conclusions about what this may lead to. On the one hand, if you recall how the Arab Spring started, it started because a vegetable seller in Tunis was roughed up, and that blew up. And from Tunisia, then the Arab Spring spread to other countries. So in this case, what has happened could lead to much wider protests and morph into a political protest against Xi Jinping and the CCP. But remember, China has always had a lot of protests, almost 100,000 or more every year, small ones. And I think a couple of years ago, they stopped publishing the statistics of these local protests in various parts of China. So there is dissatisfaction at the social level with many things in China. The second thing is that their domestic security budget is much larger than even their defense budget. So they, through their artificial intelligence and other technologies and the surveillance systems, they are keeping very close tabs on would-be protesters, would-be troublemakers. So what is surprising is that they didn't anticipate this. They were not able to figure out who the leaders were of these protests, which do not seem to be coordinated. But at the same time, the fact that they have erupted in various cities would seem to suggest that there is a much larger backing to the frustrations that the public is feeling because of this zero COVID. I may also remind you that just before the 20th Party Congress, there was a banner in Beijing which attacked Xi Jinping. So there is a subterranean, if you like, resistance to the CCP and Xi Jinping's and the fact that he has now grabbed all the power and he's got his third term. Then again, I would say that they're not going to allow this to actually lead to something big because they will control it. They will suppress it. And they're not particularly bothered about how the rest of the world sees this. You've seen how they behaved with regard to so-called human rights violations by so-called real human rights violations in Xinjiang. So, and then the manner in which they brutally suppressed the Tiananmen Square people protests in 1989. So they're now going to step back. Whether they have a mixture of softening the draconian COVID-0 policy and at the same time suppress the protests, that's a different matter. We'll see how it goes along. Of course, the rest of the world would like to project this as a massive uprising or a potentially massive uprising against Xi Jinping because they are unhappy with China and the fact that it is Xi has consolidated power even more.
Right.
And and has become even a more powerful leader to deal with, and they see a lot of problems ahead because of his stance on Taiwan and everything else.
But you're saying it's not necessarily going to be a massive uprising. Do you agree?
I don't think so.
Okay.
There will be an effort on the part of the international media to play this up because it's so unusual.
It is unusual. Of course, the UK government has responded after a BBC journalist was assaulted while covering these protests. Ambassador Trigunayat, do you agree with that view that this is nothing new for Xi Jinping and the government? They will find ways to suppress it. Ambassador Sibal spoke about Tiananmen Square. I just wanted to, add one contextual line to it. This is 2022, when you have social media, however restricted, also in China, where information is spreading faster.
Well, I fully agree with what Ambassador Sibal has said. It is, there are various groups in China, and there have been demonstrations that have been witnessed all along. So that is also a policy to softening it and muzzling it out, and at the same time allowing in some places for smaller groups to do so. But this time, China is one of the, I think, the only country that has really followed the zero COVID policy compared to the rest of the world, which has begun to learn to live with it. At the same time, I think that this fire that broke out, which killed about 10 people who could not get out, was an immediate trigger. And on the other hand, they have been watching. And, even though there are these controls on social media and others in China to some extent, but I remember I was there 2 years ago, and then they use VPN and other modalities of the technology, whereby they are able to access a lot of information outside. And of course, they love football. And when they see what is happening in Qatar, that obviously frustrates the people a little more. And obviously, any country, I mean, wherever it does, even if it is China for that matter, the kind of policing they have on a daily basis, and really everybody is virtually under the radar and surveillance. There also, the people have been rising, and we have seen what happened in Hong Kong for a quite long time. It happened, and again this is happening, and including in the Tsinghua University, where President Xi Jinping himself is an alumni of. So it will continue some time, but at the same time, I know that they were thinking of easing these restrictions gradually. Now, if under the pressure they will do it, that might blow up in a different direction altogether and may embolden some of these protesters. But I think that China's internal system is pretty strong in that sense and may not allow beyond a point.
The question at the end of the day is, however large the Chinese government is, however strong and tech-backed their surveillance is, it's 1.4 billion people. Ajay Bagga, do you think this is going to be a storm in a teacup for China? And that kind of jitteriness that we're seeing in markets, you've seen crude sliding down on fears that there will be less demand after China slows down, etc. Do you think that's overstated?
No, crude prices are more based on the demand, so demand will come down. It has been coming down because of the zero COVID lockdowns that are happening, Tamanna. I don't foresee much, but I'm the least qualified amongst this panel to really talk about Chinese internal affairs. But what little assessment I can make, 1989 was different. China was not the second biggest country. It wasn't part of WTO, and it wasn't the factory to the world. Today, it is the factory to the world. So any disruption in China, as you mentioned, Apple, they're going to lose about 6 million iPhones, which will not be produced in time for the festive season. Being the factory to the world, the supply disruptions will cause their own inflationary pressures. The inputs not being absorbed, given that China absorbs something like 60% of iron ore, 60% of copper produced in the world is absorbed in China, consumed in China, that will not get done. And being the second biggest consumer of oil, any demand deterioration in China is causing this issue with the oil market. So today, China versus 1989 China is a very different proposition. It has ramifications globally for the supply chains, for commodity prices, and in turn for markets. If anything will happen, I doubt. 1 in 10 Chinese is part of the Communist Party. Their security apparatus is so strong and they are ruthless towards their own population. So that doesn't make for a great mix in terms of democratic aspirations getting any fulfillment or any space at all. It will be ruthlessly crushed and it will be business as usual. Nothing much is going to come out of these.
All right, so nothing much is going to come out of this. Does it dent Mr. Jinping's zero COVID policy? Let me come to you, Mr. Joshi, on that. Can he really continue with this in the face of, patients wearing thin?
Well, the problem is that according to a Bloomberg intelligence report, if he reopens at this point, it could lead to 363 million infections. Some 5.8 million people could be admitted to ICUs, and there could be 620,000 deaths. This is a Bloomberg intelligence report, and they have based it on an analysis of the spread of Omicron in US and Europe. So if they open up, and Omicron is the big issue in China, it spreads. These are the results: 620,000 deaths, 5.8 million people in ICUs. Chinese don't have enough ICU space. They are desperately building hospitals. They're crash course in building hospitals. They have not vaccinated a substantial portion of their older people. So, the point is that the Xi Jinping is in a dilemma, meaning he can carry on, these protests may carry on. On the other hand, he opens up and there's this catastrophe. And this catastrophe we have seen. Don't forget our own Delta wave. We've lost millions of people in India, though the government doesn't acknowledge it. The United States has lost 1 million people. Many countries have lost a lot of people. China has been successful so far in preventing these deaths. But now Xi Jinping is confronted with this, that the people are fed up with the techniques that are being used. And so it's his choice, meaning it's the CPC's choice. Does it have the courage to carry on, or does it, accept what the public is saying and open up? And then all the consequences are there.
Now, this fear about cases jumping up is definitely there, but I just want to put it into perspective. Cases have been gone high as 40,000 so far, even as these protests have been going on. Ambassador Trigunayat, isn't China facing what pretty much every country in the world faced, that dilemma between lives and livelihood? Eventually, countries did choose to relax some of their policies and lockdowns. Herd immunity spread, and they moved on. So that choice will have to be made sooner or later, isn't it?
Well, you're right, absolutely. I mean, this is a stark choice, frankly, between the lives and the livelihood. But China has also been one of the countries that have been accused of really spawning this disease. And at the same time, this has not been, has so far been able to contain it, a much bigger spread by following the kind of policies that they are following even now. It has, of course, impacted their economy. I mean, the growth has gone down to about 3%. There is the supply chains disruptions have taken place, but this is as Mr. Joshi just spoke. I mean, if the mathematical models, if you were to apply, then you are looking at a much bigger problem, and that is the challenge that Xi Jinping definitely faces, and I'm quite sure the Chinese decision makers will look at it. But at the end of the day, whatever it is, this might be a communist welfare state of sorts, where the government is looking after the kind of draconian measures that he used to contain their population are also very inhuman, and they have a potential of creating more problems for Xi Jinping going ahead.
About it, horror stories of suddenly a check in a mall and then families being separated, kids being separated from their parents and put into camps because someone's tested COVID positive. Ambassador Sibal, will we see true change or just sort of leeway with easing up of restrictions to some extent?
Well, at the 20th Party Congress, you read Xi Jinping's report. He's very emphatic that the zero COVID policy will continue. Now, if we were to step back from this policy very visibly, then I think he's going to lose face. And it'll then be an issue of Xi Jinping maintaining his posture as the greatest leader of China after Mao Zedong. So I don't think he's going to relent because that was a formal position that was taken. But at the same time, it's not impossible that he takes some pragmatic steps to ease this, taking into consideration what Manoj had just said about the potential for a widespread problem that he might face in case he relents of several million deaths and whatever it is. I don't think that's a realistic scenario, but nevertheless, there could be a pragmatic decision to ease up. But fundamentally, I don't think that he will allow these protests to continue because these protests can then become political. And behind these protests, you may never know whether there is also a build-up of frustration amongst the Chinese public, not only with regard to COVID, but with regard to freedom and democracy and all that, because some of the things that have been posted, some of the placards that have been carried by the protesters and some of the things that they have said relate to this, democracy and freedom and everything else. And then, of course, China's economy is slowing down, so that creates pressures in terms of jobs and everything else. Then he has placed enormous restrictions on the private sector, which again also has affected the economic situation. So there's a combination of factors which would alert Xi Jinping and the party that they can't allow these protests to go out of hand. And therefore, I think they will suppress them. But at the same time, they'll take some pragmatic steps in order to diffuse the situation by easing somewhat, but not dramatically, this zero COVID policy.
Bagga, in terms of impact for the world, China is supposed to be the factory of the world. Slowdown in China causes concerns. Possible spike in infection causes concerns. How are markets looking at it?
Worried. Markets definitely, you saw from Asia to Europe today, European stocks 600, which is the entire European continent being represented, was down 0.9% at the open. US markets opened down. So clearly markets are quite worried. One, stability of China is very critical because there could be a misadventure either on India or Taiwan to distract people from domestic issues. That becomes a geopolitical risk. A strong man under pressure domestically can act in haste internationally. So the geopolitical risk goes up. The economic risks are very well laid out. Third is what Sibal Saab said. I totally agree. It's also a culmination of multiple issues. The property market, for example, Tamanna, so many mortgages are at levels where the underlying house prices are no longer justifying those mortgage levels. The property sector is in shambles, and that is a good 19% of the GDP. It is 30% of revenue of local governments, which are already very highly indebted. In a society which is 250% debt to GDP ratio, so their growth has been largely on leverage, on state level leverage, local governments, provincial governments, and the central government taking a lot of debt. And the linkage with the world is 15 trillion strong. That's their dollar bond issuance outstanding. So anything happens in China, will have a very serious impact not only on the global economies. You saw a Korean export number coming at minus 17% because of the Chinese slowdown. So not only is China the supplier, it's also the consumer of intermediate goods from Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, you name it. And then you take on the commodities, both agri commodities as well as energy commodities and metals. The entire thing is run by the Chinese demand and the Chinese real estate growing, infrastructure growing. So if you have issues with that, the global economy also suffers. It is the second biggest economy today. So both on consumption as well as supply levels, it has big ramifications, and markets are first to react. Markets discount the future faster. So we are seeing the market reaction today.
All right. So a very unstable situation right now, which needs to be tracked closely. We'll have to see how Xi Jinping responds to these protests. And also remember, this is a time when the world is watching and is watching very carefully whether the government there smashes down and quells these protests in any kind of an aggressive manner. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you.